Season 1 is finally here, and in this video we'll cover a general gearing guide as well as gear sources. Do keep in mind that this is under the context that we're max level, which is level 80, and that we have the War Within expansion. So for those unfamiliar, here's a quick rundown of each tier level of gear we can get. There's Explorer, Adventurer, Veteran, Champion, Hero, and Mythic, which all scale accordingly. All have their own varying rates of item level that's affected by our character's level, which is why maxing out a character is ideal first before we start to grind for these gear sources. Now on to those sources. Our first obvious source of gear is going to be from doing content in general. Things like the campaign and even some side quest lines reward pieces of gear. At max level, which is 80, these usually pan out to either be greens or blue items, and they're Explorer tier gear. So that'll be pieces of gear or equipment with item levels between 558 all the way up to 580. The next gear sources are going to be from daily stuff that we can do in Castle Gar. So these are going to be the world quests for each zones and hunting the leveling and weekly rares, which drop loot and a reputation with their zones factions, and both of these either give you Explorer tier gears or even Adventurer tier. Now keep in mind that the world quests have two versions. The easier ones usually give currency or Explorer tier gear, while the somewhat harder ones give blue or Adventurer tier gear. You can tell which is which just by hovering over the icon on our maps. Another thing while doing world quests is that we'll unlock these special assignments, but I'll get back to them once we're at the weekly activities section. Now on to the weekly sources for gear. We'll have the world events, which are the Spreading the Light at Hollowfall, the Theater Troop in the Isle of Dorn, the Awakening the Machine event at the Ringing Deeps, and the weekly pack choosing over at Ashgahet. Now each of these weeklies will reward us with a weekly cash, and these all have a shared weekly loot lockout. The first two ones that we open will contain a piece of adventure tier gear, which is item level 571, and it even has a chance of giving us veteran tier gear, which are item level 584. Now past that 2-point marker where we've opened two weekly caches, the third and the fourth one will only give us restored coffer keys and some currency, while opening past that 4-point marker will only give us currency like resonance crystals and gold. This means we can't do one event and then another and expect to get gear from all of those weeklies or events if you've received past that 2 weekly caches already. Now it's also worth mentioning that the Spreading the Light event has these minor bonus weekly quests, which give you these Lamplighter supply satchels, and these have a small chance of dropping in item level 561 Explorer gear. Now about those special assignments that I mentioned earlier, they usually rotate every week throughout the 4 zones, and they require us to first complete 2 or 3 world quests in the zone they're in before we can actually do them. Keep in mind that these special assignments will award us with a weekly cash, so similar to the cash system that I mentioned earlier, the first 2 ones will give us gear, while the third and the fourth one will only give us restored coffer keys. Now if for some reason you're not able to see the special assignments, then we'll need to complete a storyline in that zone or any unfinished quest lines related to it. It's worth noting that you can participate in these special assignments before you're level 80, but then you won't be able to loot that cash until you do reach level 80. For our next weekly source of gear, we'll have our weekly quests. We'll have the Call of the World Soul from Farron Lothar in Dornagal, which requires us to choose one of 4 options or quests to pick and choose to complete. We'll have the weekly delve quest we can pick up from Bran, which requires us to do a certain delve. And lastly, we'll also have the archive quest, and this requires us to collect 100 Titan disc fragments and turn them into Speaker Brenthy. All of these 3 weeklies will reward us with a pinnacle cache each upon completion, and like I previously mentioned earlier, our first 2 caches open will give us gear, while the next 2 will just give us restored coffer keys and goodies, while preceding ones will just give us currency like resonance crystals and gold. So we can't expect to overlap the weekly events and the weekly activities and expect to get gear. Now for our last weekly source, it's going to be from world bosses, which drop champion tier gear, which are item level 603. At the start of season 1, there's only going to be 1 world boss available out of 4, and these will rotate on a weekly basis. So it's going to be Kordak, Aggregation of Horrors, Shurai, and Orta. Defeating a world boss has a chance of giving us some gear on the champion tier, and as a reminder, the world bosses are currently unsoloable even if you are fully maxed gear. So to take one down, we are going to need a ton of people, essentially a party or even a 10-man raid party. Our next source of gear is going to come from crafting orders, and from these we can get some pretty decent gear ranging from item level 593 all the way up to item level 610. That'll be veteran or even hero tier. Now mind you, the item level of the gear will be affected by the Spark of Omens. Now as for crafting the gear itself, including the Spark of Omens, luckily enough we do have a tracking system, and this allows us to pin the ingredients to our quest tab, so sort of like a shopping list to remind you of the things you need to collect to get these ingredients, especially since you can buy some of these from the auction house, though they are quite pricey at the moment. Now for the Spark of Omens I mentioned earlier, these are going to be time locked or capped every week. And what I mean by that is that we'll get these fractured Spark of Omens every week, meaning every 2 weeks we'll be able to get 2 of these, and we'll be able to combine them to turn them into the Spark of Omens, and then we'll be able to use that to craft that purple gear I mentioned earlier. Take note that we'll be able to get 2 free ones at the start of season 1. They'll be received in a form of a quest over at Custodian Kubon, who's at the anvil structure at the heart of Dornagal, right next to the catalyst. Now if you weren't able to play the past few weeks or the next preceding weeks, then don't worry, since we'll be able to get fractured sparks in another way. So for this example, let's say you haven't played for 3 weeks since season 1 began, so you've missed quite a lot of fractured sparks. Well, because of this, you're eligible to receive these fractured sparks as drops from the weekly events or even the raid bosses. The system is made this way so that the people who weren't able to farm the fractured sparks from earlier or who missed a couple weeks will be able to get the weekly cap to the current people who do have this amount of fractured sparks. I hope that makes sense. Additionally, we can get some pretty decent adventure and veteran blue tier gears, and the good thing here is that they're quite relatively easy to craft since we don't need a Spark of Omen to make them. So the ingredients we need to craft them are purchasable from the auction house, and by the time we leveled up a character to 80, we should have enough gold to get some of the material in order to craft the gear, but not all of it. So we can use these for an easy gear boost once we do hit level 80, but take note, these blue crafted order gears are not upgradable unfortunately. Now for those people open to doing PvP content or the PvP people looking to gear up but aren't too keen to do PvE, then we'll want to head to the Forge Ground in Dornagal. Once here, we'll want to do 2 things. First, we'll want to pick up the weekly quests that Rufius offers, and then we'll want to head inside this building to pick up the quest, Weapons of Conquest from Lalandi. And the reason we want to do this is because we can get some pretty decent veteran tier gear from the War Mode Quartermaster, which is also inside that building, and they'll be selling item level 593 veteran gear. Now additionally, from the other weekly quests, we'll be rewarded some conquests, and what we want to do with these is head on over to this recipe vendor who sells these heraldy items, which we want to use for crafting orders but for the PvP gear. Obviously, we'll want the purple herald item since they'll get our crafted PvP gear all the way up to 639 item level if we use the Forge Gladiator's heraldy. And what's good about the Forge Gladiator's heraldy is it's not only item level 639 during PvP, but if we craft it at max rank as a standalone, it's going to be an item level 610 piece of non-PvP gear, and it doesn't even require a spark or the Spark of Omens to craft. So from the PvP content, we can get ourselves to farm enough blood tokens from the open world PvP to get some war mode gear, which are item level 593, and with conquest we'll purchase the crafting regions to make even better PvP over at the crafting order. Now lastly, after we finish the quest Weapons of Conquest, we'll get a free PvP weapon when we finish it by collecting 2,500 conquests during the season 1. Our next source for gear are going to be from the Renown rewards. We'll mainly be looking at 2 things per faction here. The first being the feature to be able to purchase gear once we reach a certain Renown level. So the first checkpoint will be at either Renown 5, 6, 7, or 8, depending on faction, while the last gear checkpoint will be around Renown 16 or even 18. Once we do reach those Renown levels, we'll be able to purchase the gear for resonant crystals, and mind you, these pieces of gear are upgradable. So for the Council of Dornagal, we can purchase the item level 584 veteran tier shoulder gear at Renown 7 from the renowned vendor Auditor Bulwers for 2,600 resonance crystals. And at Renown 16, we can get the boots, which are item level 597 champion tier for 3,900 resonance crystals. From the Assembly of the Deeps, we'll be able to purchase an item level 584 veteran tier helmet for 2,600 crystals from Waxmonger's Squick at Renown 8, and at Renown 19 18, we can get an item level 597 champion tier waist gear for 3,900 crystals. From the Halofol Arathi, we'll actually get a quest at Renown 5 that gives us a necklace, which is at item level 571, and once at Renown 7, we'll be able to buy an item level 584 veteran tier chest for 2,600, and at Renown 18, we'll be able to purchase the wrist gear, which are item level 597 and our champion tier for 3,900 resonance crystals from Aurelia's Steel Strike. And lastly, from the Severed Threads Renown, we'll be able to purchase trinkets at Renown 6, and these are item level 571 and adventure tier gear. Now that's going to be one of the things we mainly want to level up our factions for. Our second last thing is once we reach Renown 24 with each faction, we'll get a free heroic level crest, which we can then use to craft the item level 619 gear with the crafting order requiring the Spark of Omens we mentioned earlier. And now moving on to delves. As of season 1, we'll be able to go up to tier 8 on delves, and each tier will give us a chance of gear at the end, which will scale depending on how difficult or how high on the tier list up we do the delve on. So for example, if we do a delve at tier 3, we'll get adventure tier gear, while tiers 4 up to 6 can give us up to veteran gear, which are going to be items level 584 and above. Additionally, we're going to have two variants or versions of delves. We have the regular ones and the bountiful delves. To be able to tell which delve is a bountiful one, we'll just have to look at our maps and check which one has an icon that's glowing. Now, on the contrary to delves, these bountiful ones can only be done 4 times per day per character before they get a daily loot lockout. The bountiful delves give us way better rewards when we open the bountiful chest at the end, but in order to open that coffer, we have to make sure we have a restored coffer key or 100 of these coffer key shards. We can get a key from the weekly quests and events I mentioned earlier, like the special assignments for example, or we can unlock the feature to purchase them from Sir Finley Murgleton in Dornagal once we progress through the Delves Progress Journal, so we can check how far we are on this Delves Progress by this book in front of Bran. Or alternatively, we can collect 100 coffer key shards that I mentioned earlier. These are rewarded from some world quests or even the World Soul events or any outdoor event throughout Castle Gar. Combining 100 of these will give us 1 restored coffer key. Also, we do have a chance of getting these Delvers bounty maps. These can randomly drop from doing a bountiful delve on any difficulty or even just normal ones after we open the chests at the end. But try to keep a realistic output since this has a really low drop chance below 1%. And as another way to get these bountiful maps, we have a chance of getting one from Zekvir when he invades us during our delve, and they also have a chance of dropping the map once we deal with Zekvir. Now take note that the tier or the level of the delve that the bountiful map drops from will affect the scaling of the map that we get from it. So what this means is that we'll want to be doing higher level delves to get the maps to drop higher levels, which in turn will give us even better loot. And lastly, the Great Vault at the end of each week will reward us with gear that will scale on the tier or difficulty we do the delves on. I mentioned this earlier. So if we do delves at tier 8, we can get item level 616, so that will be hero tier gear, so that's really good. Now for our next source of gear, they're gonna come from dungeons. As of the time of making this video, this upcoming week of Mythic should be out, or it should be coming out, so we can get up to item level 593, which is veteran level. Additionally, from the weekly Great Vault, depending on what dungeon difficulties we do them on, our rewards can either be item level 593 veteran gear or even item level 603 champion gear. But that's not including Mythic Plus, since they scale quite higher depending on what keystone difficulty it's at. But to give an example, if you do Mythic Plus 6, you can get champion tier gear, but since the Great Vault scales from the difficulty of instances and activities, then we can get it up to 613. Now for our last source of gear, currently on season 1 we now have access to Nerebar Palace, which will be the first raid in the War Within. We'll be able to do this raid on LFR Wing 1, Normal, Heroic, and as of making this video, on the upcoming week 2 of season 1, Mythic difficulty is now available. So the LFR difficulty will give us item level 584 up to item level 600 gears, which are veteran tiers. For normals, we'll be able to get item level 597 all the way up to item level 613, which is champion tier gear. For heroic raid difficulty, this will give us gears of item level 610 up to 626, which is going to be hero tier. And for the mythic difficulty of the raid, we can get gear with item level 623 and very rarely even up item level 639, which are the near maximum item levels that we can get for the game currently. Also, at the time of making this video, by tomorrow or the next day, the story mode of the Nerebar Palace is going to be released, as well as the second wing of the raid. This is essentially a more chill version of the actual scale of the raid, so it will have a reduced difficulty and it's more focused on allowing players to experience the raid as a whole. While the story mode difficulty of the raid doesn't drop any rewards or loot, it will give us a heroic level crest, which we can use to craft pieces of gear with item level 619 along with the Spark of Omens that we mentioned earlier during the crafting segment. So we can make use of this to essentially even further boost our gear. First off, we'll want to start this short quest line from Executor Nezrek here in this building at the City of Threads, and once done with the quest line, we'll be given the quest which requires us to defeat the last boss of the raid in any difficulty, but the option to do this on story mode is available, and as a reward we'll get a heroic crest. Before we end the video, do keep in mind that while doing some of the outdoor activities or completing dailies and weeklies, we'll have a chance of getting these crests. As for the sources of these, we can typically find them just by doing content in general, but take note there are 4 tiers of the crests. The weathered crests are for explorer tier and halfway through veteran, while the carved crest will be needed from veteran up to champion. The rune crest will be for champion tier up to hero, and then it'll be purely gilded crests for upgrading the hero tier gear pieces all the way up to capping our myth tier equipment, which is going to be from item level 623 up to 639. The weathered crests can drop from doing world quests, finding treasures in Kazalgar, doing delves, heroic dungeons, and LFR raid bosses. As for the carved crests, we can get them from the weekly world events from the world bosses, mythic dungeons up to +3, as well as doing normal raid bosses. Now for the last 2 crests, these can drop from mythic plus dungeons, heroic, and mythic raid bosses. The rune crest drops from mythic +4 all the way up to mythic +8 keystone levels and from heroic raid bosses. And lastly, the gilded crest drops from mythic +9 and above and mythic raids. And lastly, in terms of gears, there's a catalyst located in the city of Dornagal, and to use it, we'll need to have a harmonized silk. For the first week of season 1, we'll be given our first charge, and afterwards, we'll be getting one every other week, similar to how it worked back in Dragonflight season 3. To use it, we'll just need to make sure we have a veteran gear or higher available, but crafted pieces of gear won't be eligible for this system. After we use the harmonized silk, we'll turn that piece of gear into our season 1 set pieces for the War Within. But that's all of the gear sources as of season 1, as well as how to gear up in general. Leave a like and subscribe if you found this information useful. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.